there is a larger global element to it. And when you look at the larger global aspect to it, there is an entity which sort of promotes cross-border movement of capital, which are your Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. There is an entity which is working towards cross-border movement of goods and services, right? In as much as there is pushback from some countries, there is some agency which works towards this, which is your WTO, before that the GATT, and not to mention the various regional formations of this. But we don't find anything in the international legal perspective which works with countries to lower their barriers. We have, say, the UNHRC, but that focus, it's more of a defensive approach, right? Which is to say, when people do cross, this is how they will, this is their rights, these are the obligations of states and so on. But nothing which sort of immediately works like with the WTO, which negotiates with nations to reduce their tariff barriers, or an IMF or a World Bank which doesn't really negotiate with anyone, which just tells people to reduce capital barriers to capital. We don't find any equivalent organization body at the international level for people, for movement of people. Can we imagine a body which does that? Right? Like, for instance, as far as I can tell, the only multilateral body which seems to be doing this is, of all people, the EU. But even then, it is only in the regional context, right? You still have border limits. I mean, you have immigration limits when it comes into the EU. But within the EU, there is free movement and the right to settle and so on. Can we imagine, right? Not that how we will get there, but can we imagine a body which works to promote free movement of people across borders? And anybody who has any thoughts or any ideas on this.
I think it's a nice imagination to have, but could perhaps be an impossibility, particularly given the context of the Indian subcontinent.
Right.
So I think in the context of Assam, what we could perhaps imagine much watered down version of an ideal situation is work permits. If we come to that we strip people of their citizenship, and I'm using the word strip because there are a lot of other Indians who are genuine Indian citizens who perhaps are very poor and do not have documents, as we have been saying throughout. So work permits could perhaps be a first step in which we can see that people who in our mind belong to another country coming in and working. And this is not people who belong to a certain class, but people who are very poor and doing that. We've seen that how it operates along the border in, say, the zero line areas. Along the entire Indo-Bangladesh border, you are manned by sort of border guards Bangladesh on that side, BSF on this. So people are actually working using work permits. So perhaps that could be one step. But that aside, I think the political compulsions are such, it would be very difficult. We've tried it with trade blocks. I mean, the SARC, I don't know where it stands. Yeah. And so it doesn't work out in my mind.
I suppose the only place where it is working to some extent is the EU, but that's part of a larger economic organization. I don't know. I think a world body to facilitate free movement of people, I don't think it's going to happen. And maybe certainly not during our lifetime, I think. Well, certainly my lifetime, there are all the younger people here, so maybe during their lifetime it may happen, but certainly I don't see it happening in my lifetime. Because there is a rise of, nationalism, feelings of nationalism generally, and see this sort of identity, I mean, to a large extent it's, a free movement. I think while you move as an economic worker, I don't think people have a problem with, right? People have a problem with the cultural identity that travels with that individual, right? So while countries are willing to accept people as an economic worker, they're not willing to accept what the worker brings along, and that is where the problem rises. That is essentially the problem that most people, I mean, say the US or EU are all facing about.
Right.
We face a different problem, right? I mean, yes, now, because of, and I want to make this very clear. I mean, the problem in Assam is not a problem that the BJP has created. I mean, let's be very, very clear about it. People shouldn't get the wrong impression. This has been there for, ever since Assam became part of, the British Dominion, not just India. I mean, became part of British India, this problem has been there, and you should go about it. So don't go away thinking that it is a problem that's been created in the last 4 years. It is not, right? It's much longer problem, and many people have contributed to the problem, and not just what is today. Yes, the bill is a politically cynical ploy to come up with it, to take advantage of the situation, but the problem is different. So I don't think, Alok, I mean, it's something that I don't see it happening.
Okay. Leah, did you?
Yeah, and I think world over we are seeing countries becoming more and more insular. Even within the EU, like Hungary, there's a huge anti-immigrant movement. Their leader is tremendously anti-immigrant. So again, I don't see that really becoming reality. And I feel that people are also more open when the economy is doing well, when there is a boom. As soon as there is a recession, the first thing that happens is people become insular. Then they don't want to accept immigrants, they don't want to accept accept outsiders, and I think we are looking at a world that is moving into a recession. So unless we have a huge economic boom, I don't see that kind of openness.
I mean, the other thing is also what we have seen in, say, the Dominican Republic. We had a similar situation, what we face today in Assam, where 200,000 people of Haitian origin, they were stripped of their citizenship. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights, they said that you can't do this, and sort of, again, this linkage thing, which they wanted to make mandatory for your citizenship. So this is a trend. I think it's a global trend in terms of people who, the original inhabitant, the word which we use specifically for Assam, I think it stays in letter and spirit in other parts of the world as well. That who belongs and who doesn't.
Yeah. And just on that point of the, since you brought the discussion also back to Assam and who stays and who doesn't, there's an interesting and somewhat depressing intersection between the discussion on the Citizenship Amendment Bill and the NRC, which is that as it stands, the Citizenship Amendment Bill is more or less in limbo, partly because of the response to it in the Northeast states, not just Assam. Across the Northeast, you have had lots of agitation, not say anywhere near the level of scale that was seen in the 80s, but you've had a very strong pushback, at the very least, against the provisions of the Citizens Amendment Bill, but not for the right reasons, right? We have had a pushback more for the wrong reasons, if possible, where the notion is that no one should be able to get citizenship if they've come in as migrants and so on, rather than only a select number of people. So it's not as if you want to expand the rights, but you want to shrink it even further, and on different tangents. So maybe we can sort of think about perhaps what is going on in Assam. It sort of sees this, not just in Assam, and across the Northeast, which sort of sees this intersection of these two things which you have just mentioned, and how one is feeding into the other.
I mean, the one thing is, perhaps we could then travel back to the time of introduction of inner line permit. And in fact, there are groups which talk about the inner line permit to be reintroduced. In Manipur, we've seen that. And in fact, the BJP rode on the inner line permit wave during the state elections there. In fact, the fear of having the outsider come in is so much that in Arunachal, when this entire proposal for a train line to be introduced in Itanagar came up, they said you can't do that because the trains are going to get in outsiders, and then illegal immigrants and Bangladeshis will settle. So this seems to be a narrative perhaps which has been sort of milked by political parties. And we've seen that not just in the northeastern states, we've also seen that in parts of West Bengal. And so this continues for reasons political mostly. We've seen that in various riots which have played out all throughout Assam, and in fact also in Meghalaya, where people were sort of forced to, were evicted. People sort of Bengali origin, then there have been riots between people who are Nepalis. And this seems to be happening also within Assam. There's a certain sort of group of people who are controlling resources, who want to sort of even call the shots for whatever decisions are taken. Even if you see, even within the United Liberation Front of Assam, even within that, there is a very upper caste Assamese structure which operates. So these are sort of, it's an inherent thing which is at the core of, I think, the politics of the region.
Interestingly, even though the Citizenship Amendment Bill is in limbo right now, an order has been sent to certain states, to DCs, to collectors, to start identifying members of persecuted minorities from these countries. So, I mean, I don't know what the plan is because the bill is not going to be passed anytime soon, but the process of identification of these persecuted minorities is beginning in some states.
On the other aspect that we sort of hinted at, and something that you also spoke about, is the foreigners' tribunals themselves, and that we have had these very defective institutions in charge of an issue, something like this. And it brings me to something that Harish mentioned. It's apart from what they are doing, right? You could make the argument that this is the job of the NRC, of the foreigners' tribunals, whereas say overseeing the NRC is not the Supreme Court's this thing. But a common problem, which came through from the initial comments, was in the procedure. And for those of you who haven't read it, I would all suggest you please pick up Anuj Bhuvanya's Courting the People. It's by far one of the best books on the law and on specifically the courts in India, which has come out in the 2 years, and it specifically talks about PIL and the kind of damage that it has done to the court's notion of what is right procedure. But I sort of thought maybe Leah and then Harish could sort of talk about the procedural failings of these courts, that maybe what we aren't doing, or perhaps not enough people are doing, is calling out the failures in the procedure. Yes, there is, in terms of how they're functioning, and there are, in terms of their function, yes, that's problematic. But I thought maybe we could dwell a little bit on the formal procedures set down for this court. Is there enough scrutiny? Are they being held accountable for following or not following the procedure? Is perhaps something that maybe we could talk about a little bit more about.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of procedure, first of all, they are themselves not clear whether they are following civil or criminal procedure. The tribunal members themselves are a little confused about that. There's that. Then, as I had said, because the Indian Evidence Act applies to these proceedings, it's actually very difficult for anyone to prove their citizenship. These proceedings are supposed to be completed in 60 days. So in 60 days, a person has to get certified copies of documents that prove that their forefathers were in Assam, linkage documents, documents that link them to these forefathers. And the proceedings are so it's conducted like a civil case. So there's a written statement, there's examination, evidence in chief, there's cross-examination, and then the judgment. So all this is supposed to be completed in 2 months. And as I had said, I mean, for poor people to go to some other part of the state, get the certified copies, that itself is such a tiring process for them. The process just doesn't take into account the reality of lives of people and documents. So yeah, I mean, it's quite a violent process in that sense. And since the burden of proof is reversed, the state actually has to do nothing. I mean, they just have to produce the person, and in a lot of cases, there's no investigation. And the tribunal members are actually not questioning the police. I mean, the police have to have a reason for even suspecting that the person is a foreigner. It can't be like, I have picked up these 20 people, now they are before the... So investigations are really lax, and the Guwahati High Court has pulled up the police for that, but from what we have seen, things have not improved much. And because there is this pressure to declare more and more people foreigners, the procedure is just getting more and more lax. And of course, there is an appeal to the Guwahati High Court, but I mean, how many people can really afford that? legal aid is quite poor. I mean, we know of a few lawyers who provide pro bono services, but to just depend on the individual goodness of certain lawyers, I mean, that's not really a fair process. So, yeah, that's.
I mean, there's this thing which we have put on our report. We spoke to some lawyers there. So, how the proceeding happens in the foreigner tribunal is the foreigner tribunal member asks the accused, "Do you know what's written here?" pointing to the written evidence submitted to the tribunal in English. And if the person says yes, then the foreigners tribunal member asks, "Tell us what is written in this paragraph." If the accused replies, "I don't know English," then the foreigners tribunal member writes, "The accused is saying he doesn't know." So all of this is done to put the accused in a spot. And once the person says, "I don't know," then the person is declared a foreigner. So this is like 1,221 foreigners were declared every month in 2017. So far you have in 6 detention centers, all of which are inside jails in Assam, 1,037 declared foreigners. And there's no segregation between the declared foreigners from under trials and convicts. There's no sort of families are separated, and children are growing up in detention centers, and people have been in detention centers for more than like 6, 7, 8 years, for 9 years. And so this is it all sort of emanates from the foreigners tribunal. It's a quasi-judicial body, and in a foreigners tribunal, if you do not have, say, a lawyer, government lawyer is not there. So the foreigners tribunal member himself starts cross-examining the person. So it's in contravention of rules which should be followed.
I don't have much to add to the foreigners tribunal because
Apart from the foreigners tribunal, I thought maybe we could take this to the larger question also, that what perhaps is manifesting in these tribunals is the larger failure of courts in India to take procedures seriously. And something that while we may appreciate it in the context of PIL, it might leak its way into other things as well. Keep in mind, even the NRC case started off as a PIL.
I mean, we can go on about the failure of the court system. It may sound very cynical to a room full of young law students, but see, we have a dysfunctional court system, right? And there's no other way of putting it. And I'm not talking about extraordinary situations like what Leah and Arijit are talking about, which is where your very existence is in question, correct? So that's an extraordinary situation. And if in an extraordinary situation, then actually you need to be more careful. So, but if you look at what happens in courts across the country in ordinary situations, then that makes me extremely cynical about these tribunals, right? I haven't seen the functioning of any of these tribunals, so I'm not in a position to comment. But since Alok asked me to comment about legal process in general, there is a problem. We have a problem with how courts function in terms of process, in terms of procedure, and all you need to do is sit in a court for a full working day to figure out the fact that it isn't working. Now, the surprise is not that there is so much failure. The surprise is that even now, occasionally, justice gets done, and very well. So that's what gives us hope of reforming the legal process and judicial process. But there is a problem in terms of how what happens in judicial process. There is a problem in particularly in the way trials are conducted. There's a serious language problem in terms of English and Kannada. I'll give you an example. A friend sent me this joke about what happened in a case. He was arguing that the witness was. How many of you can understand Kannada here? Half of them. The others can speak to these guys to find out the nuances of the joke. So he's asking, the lawyer is cross-examining. It's a woman has come. It's some sort of partition dispute. So woman is the witness. Sister is the witness. So the lawyer is asking, Nivu nimanna matartira inna. Basically he's asking, are you in touch with your brother, who is a counterparty, and how are your relations with your brother? So the lady says, tumba ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಸರ್, ತುಂಬ ಅವರು ಹೋಗಿ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಗೆ, ನಾವು ಹೋಗಿ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತೀವಿ, ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ. So the judge dictates to the stenographer, the witness states that she has intimate relationships with her brother. Now, if it goes on appeal, right, to a judge who doesn't understand what the context was, it could become difficult, and it will become difficult if somebody sees the transcript, right? So there is a challenge in terms of language, and so the situation which Arijit was just describing, I mean, doesn't surprise me, because this happens in normal circumstances when there are no issues of the nature that you're talking about. Yes, the property could be very serious even in a partition dispute, but there is a